I'd also like to introduce our guest in New York, Mr. Caleb Maupin. He's with the International Action Center. My first question to Caleb Maupin in New York: why do you think, Mr. Maupin, that victory has become so elusive for the U.S. forces in Afghanistan?
Well, it's pretty clear the United States is not in Afghanistan to fight against al-Qaeda. In fact, the people who laid the basis for al-Qaeda were U.S. allies in Afghanistan during the 1980s. In 1979, the people of Afghanistan had a revolution and began constructing what they called a people's democracy. Democratic youth leagues were formed that began construction all throughout the country. And the U.S. met with the forces, the Mujahideen, people like Osama bin Laden, and used them to destabilize and eventually overthrow the People's Democratic Government in Afghanistan. The people who laid the basis for al-Qaeda were U.S. allies. And it's pretty clear that the U.S. is in Afghanistan because there are many countries around the world that are rejecting the rule of Wall Street in the United States. Countries like Russia, Iran, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and having a base, having troops in the middle, in Central Asia as they do, is a way to assert their power and force. That's what it's really about. The fact that the U.S. is aligned with so-called al-Qaeda forces in Syria, used them in Libya, it's pretty clear. And let's be clear about another thing. Often there's a lot of rhetoric coming from Washington, D.C. about fighting so-called radical Islam. But you'll notice about a lot of the governments that the U.S. has overthrown have actually been secular governments. Gaddafi's Libya was a highly secular regime. Saddam Hussein's Iraq was also highly secular. So it's pretty clear the U.S. is fighting in its own economic interests, not the interests of the 99% in the United States, not the interests of working class people in the United States, but the interests of a small group of very wealthy people in the United States and in the interests of Israel. That's what's going on.
So in response, they're not willing to stay there forever. Is that the impression that you're getting as well, Mr. Maupin?
Well, I think the U.S. has long-term plans of imperialist domination of the world, and going into Afghanistan and setting up a base is part of their long-term strategy. The U.S. has been sowing instability and chaos all throughout the Middle East, whether in Syria, all throughout, and supporting the government of Israel as it continues to murder and commit aggression against its neighbors. So it's very clear that any talk from the United States of liberating people or coming to their aid, it is really false. And I think the fact that the talk of al-Qaeda continues to be used, that's an emotional thing. They can say, oh, remember 9/11? See, that's why we have to go into someone else's country and murder people. The U.S. troops in Afghanistan are occupiers. They're occupiers. They've done horrific things, defaming corpses and awful things in Afghanistan. Whenever someone goes into someone else's country and is occupying them, awful things happen. Whether it's the occupation of Northern Ireland that continues, wherever it goes on, colonizers are brutal, and the things they do are brutal against the people they're occupying. So the people of Afghanistan have the absolute right to resist the U.S. troops being in their country, and the U.S. troops need to leave so the people of Afghanistan can have their country back.
Basically, the question here would be the type of policies that the United States is taking towards militants, towards what we call insurgents. One aspect that could be raised, for instance, about the Taliban militants in Afghanistan, let's put this question to Caleb Maupin, is we're seeing the United States battling the insurgents, the Taliban militants in Afghanistan, at the same time speaking about political engagements with them, speaking about a political way out of this and even holding dialogue with them. They're opening an office, for instance, in Qatar. So how can this contradiction be explained?
Well, it's obviously a lot of hot air coming from the United States, because when people are being shot down in the street, when U.S. airstrikes and drones are murdering people in Afghanistan, the people of Afghanistan don't want dialogue with these occupiers. They want to resist. They want to resist this foreign domination of their country. And when the Mujahideen were sent into Afghanistan, and the Soviet troops went in to defend the People's Democratic Government in Afghanistan. That was nothing like what the U.S. is doing now. The Soviet Union sent troops in at the request of the popular government of Afghanistan, and while they were there, not only did they defend them against the Mujahideen forces sent in by the United States, they also engaged in agricultural aid, and they did all kinds of tremendous things for the people of Afghanistan. And the people of Afghanistan largely supported the Soviet intervention against the forces, the Mujahideen, and the forces that were sent in by the United States. And I also want to make clear, the other guest talked about how the government of Turkey is ideal. The government of Turkey is a member member of NATO. And the government of Turkey has committed horrific crimes against the people of Kurdistan. It is a crime in Turkey to even speak the Kurdish language. People are in jail. So, the government of Turkey that exists now is a puppet of the United States, has brutalized and murdered people, and it's funding these forces in Syria, which are not some popular democratic forces. These forces in Syria are, very extreme terrorists that go around cutting people's heads off, murdering civilians, murdering Christians, murdering Muslims, murdering all kinds of people left and right. These are terrorists that are being, the U.S. is funneling money through the Turkish government in Syria. So I don't think the government of Turkey is ideal. I don't think that's the case at all.
Okay,
all over the world, the U.S. is funding, Al-Qaeda-like forces to commit crimes, and it's pretty clear the U.S. is trying to export its economic exploitation around the world, and the people of whether it's in Afghanistan,
Mr.
Iraq,
I'll stop you there if I may. I want to get a
resisting.
reaction from our guest in Washington. So back to Caleb Maupin on this. Our guest there in Washington suggesting that as long as you can force or persuade some of them to lay down their arms, this is in itself some kind of an achievement. But we have people who are saying that unless all foreign forces leave Afghanistan, peace and security is not going to come to the country. What's your idea?
I think the people of Afghanistan have the absolute right to fight against the foreign domination of their country, and I think they will never be content with U.S. troops or U.S. puppets occupying their country and exploiting them. And, the other guest raised the example of Vietnam. Well, since the National Liberation Front of Vietnam was victorious, the life expectancy in Vietnam has actually gone up by 17 years. 17 years longer. The average Vietnamese person lives 17 years longer than before the people were victorious and drove the U.S. troops out. There's not a single place in this world where the U.S. has brought peace or prosperity. Every time it occupies a country, every time it overthrows a popular government, the results are, the people living, they're people living in misery, whether it's Eastern Europe, whether it's Africa. Wherever the U.S. goes in and destabilizes and destroys, the results are always negative for the people. So it's very clear, and Vietnam is an example of that. The people of Afghanistan have the absolute right to resist the U.S., to resist the people that are terrorizing them and murdering them on a daily basis, and that's all there is to it.
Well, and we are hearing indications, General Dempsey saying that we're not in a hurry, that we would want these forces to stay and train. What will be their role and why would they be in Afghanistan? A lot of people suggesting that the U.S. is after permanent bases. What do you think?
Well, if the U.S. troops continue to stay in Afghanistan, they will not be there to aid the people of Afghanistan, and they will not be there to help the people of the United States either. They will be there to further the aims of Wall Street and of Israel, and to further protect the interests of U.S. economic banking institutions and the wealthy 1% of the United States. Right now, all across this country, post offices are closing, schools are being closed down, hospitals are being shut down. This money should be spent on human needs. This money should be spent here at home in the United States to aid the people of the U.S. in this time of economic crisis with large unemployment. It should not be spent on murdering innocent people in Afghanistan and further occupying Afghanistan. The U.S. troops need to leave. They need to come home to be with their families, and the U.S. needs to stop acting as an exploitive imperialist force around the world. We need to strive for the kind of thing that the revolutionary government of Afghanistan strived for: people's democracy, equality, full employment, things like that. And it's a shame that the U.S. sent in the Mujahideen to tear down a people's democratic government in Afghanistan.
Caleb Maupin with the International Action Center with us there live from New York. Thank you very much. We have run out of time. A big thank you